guys, Geekonomics here, just bringing you a quick video with regard to regulation, and this is for those of you who are doing the AS Microeconomics paper on Monday. Regulation, potentially a question for the essay. So, with regard to regulation, what is it? What is this thing called regulation? Well, regulation is simply another method of correcting market failure. And it can be done in a number of ways. So for example, it can be done by simply closing any information gaps that may exist. So if you think of smoking, for example, and the labels on cigarette packets nowadays, which have all sorts of health warnings and so on them. So that's a great example of closing an information gap. Obviously that's not something new, that's something that's been around for some time. Secondly, those of you who have booked airline tickets, be that online primarily, when you're booking an airline ticket, it used to be the case that you would think that you were getting a tremendous bargain, particularly with the likes of Ryanair and EasyJet, and then you would get to the final page and all of these additional charges would be added, and so the fare, which initially looked very cheap and inexpensive, turned out actually to not be quite the bargain that it was. So another method of regulation is to force airlines to disclose all of the charges for an airline ticket at the start of the booking process rather than at the end, because if it's obviously all held back until the end, you're not getting what you think you're getting, you're not paying for what you think you're getting. And finally, governments may impose maximum pollution levels or ban pollution creating activities altogether. So if you do a little bit of research on this, you'll know there's something called the Environmental Protection Act of 1990, and this lays down, for example, certain requirements with regard to environmental standards for emissions which are coming out of chemical factories. So that's a great example. Another one would be, for example, the limits on emissions from car exhausts. Those of you who are new drivers or perhaps getting your first car, perhaps you're getting your first red Vauxhall Corsa with black wheels. If you fall into that category, you'll know that in a few years' time your car will have to go through its MOT test. One of the things that will be tested will be the emissions, and if you fail that MOT test, then obviously your car will... Sorry, if your car is... if too many emissions are coming out of your car, then you will fail that emissions test and you'll fail the MOT. Okay, so why would we use these regulations? Well, number one, they're easy and cheap to impose. So in that respect, from the government's point of view, this is an ideal policy. Secondly, it's very clear, the emissions targets are laid down in black and white, so very clear as the standards that are required. It can have quite an instantaneous effect. And it can be backed up by fines or other incentives in order to encourage compliance. So there's not so much of a carrot there, but there's certainly a bit of a stick, in the sense that if companies don't meet the requirements, then they will be fined or given other penalties. Now, you then, in your answer, will need to refer to a diagram. So let me just flick into the diagram. Again, this is a very familiar one to you. So this is your simple either demand and supply. You could label it simply demand S1, S2, or you could label it marginal social benefit, marginal private cost, marginal social cost. I don't really think it really matters a great deal as to which labels you use. But the whole point is that Q1 here is the allocatively inefficient level of output, and therefore you wish to reduce the level of output. So you wish to move in this direction. And one method of doing that is to introduce some type of regulation which will restrict the supply. And in so doing, you will move the level of output from Q1 to Q2, and Q2 being now the more allocative efficient level of output. So you're moving from allocative inefficiency here, AI, to allocative efficiency here. And this is a diagram which you'll be no doubt very familiar with at this stage of proceedings. So it's a very simple diagram, and your explanations of it are fairly simple as well. Do remember that Elizabeth Ring has always said, with regard to achieving top marks in the essays and so on, you need to really break this down into the finest detail and go through it step by step using connectives to explain the diagram. So for example, in order to explain this, I would say something like this. I would say the initial equilibrium level of output is at point A. Price is P1 and output is Q1. At this point, marginal private costs to the firm are too low, and as a consequence there is overproduction, too much output. Consequently, the level of output Q1 is allocatively inefficient. One method of solving this market failure would be to introduce regulation. An effective regulation or effective regulatory policy will shift the supply curve to the left. A new equilibrium is formed at point B. Quantity demanded and supplied has fallen to Q2. Price has risen to P2. P2, Q2, the new equilibrium, the final equilibrium, is the allocatively efficient level of output. So you could, that would be a sort of reasonable explanation of that diagram. You could also, if you wished, you could maybe refer a little bit more in your explanation to marginal private costs and marginal social costs, and say something along the lines of the point B is allocatively efficient because at point B the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. That is where those two curves intersect. So that would be your regulation type diagram. So those are so that's your introduction, that's your advantages, that's your diagram, and then obviously you need to evaluate. So that you then need to go into, bring back this presentation, you then need to go back into your evaluation. Let me just flick this across. So you need to evaluate this policy, and here I have 5 or 6 different evaluative comments with regard to regulation. So number 1, it's a very crude policy, this whole regulation. So it's difficult for the government to fix the right level of regulation to ensure efficiency. How does the government know how far supply needs to shift to the left in order that marginal social benefit is equal to marginal social cost? That is a very difficult task to carry out. And regulations might be too lax or too tight. Now obviously if you make the regulations too tight, you'll go to, the supply curve will shift too far left, so you'll go past the allocatively efficient level of output. If you make them too lax, you'll not go far enough. So very, very difficult to find the accurate level. And firms, for example, let's say firms have to spend £30 million fitting anti-pollution devices, but the fall in pollution is only 20 million. Well, that is not a sensible policy to be introducing, is it? Because it's costing, the cost is much greater than the net benefit which is being derived here. And that would be example of government failure in this instance. Similarly, if firms had to spend £30 million reducing the levels of pollution or whatever it might be, and as a consequence of that the fall in pollution was actually £40 million, then that would indicate that you should actually be making the firms reduce their pollution by more, so they should be spending more on these anti-pollution devices. Next point. Regulations do not discriminate between different costs of reducing an externality. So some firms will be able to reduce their levels of pollution at a relatively low cost compared to others. So for example, let's say you had 2 firms, A and B, and both firms have to reduce their pollution levels by 10%. Well, it might cost firm A £3 million to do so. It might cost firm B £10 million. Now obviously the cumulative total in terms of the reduction of pollution there would be 20%. However, firm A, it could potentially reduce its level of pollution.
Hamilton, please come to reception. Thank you.
Firm A could potentially reduce its level of pollution. I forgot my whole strand of thought now. Firm A could reduce its level of, let's go back to the beginning. Firm A could reduce its level of pollution by 10%, and it would cost it £3 million. Firm B could reduce its level of pollution by 10%, cost it £10 million. Total cost, £13 million. However, it would be more sensible to say to Firm A, if it could reduce its pollution by 20% at a cost of £6 million, it would be more sensible to discriminate and to say, Firm B, we'll leave it for you for now, but Firm A, can you reduce yours by 20%, please? And the problem with regulation is, when you impose this blanket policy across all these firms, that sort of discrimination doesn't happen. Next point, regulation, very difficult and or costly to enforce, the old enforcement costs problem. There's an opportunity cost as well to this enforcement, because obviously it requires resources going into it to monitor it and so on. You may find that in certain markets, black markets will develop. So, you're pushing activities from the legal into the illegal markets, where there is no regulation at all. So again, that's not in anybody's interests. You could also find that people just say, oh well, you're going to impose this regulation, I'm just going to ignore it, and whatever financial penalty you give me, I'll just pay it, because it's cheaper to pay whatever fine you give me than to actually try to reduce the pollution levels. If it's with regard to pollution in a certain country, or if it's a sort of a global regulation, well, obtaining international agreements, as you will well know, I'm sure, from the Kyoto Protocol and so on, with regard to global emissions and getting deals on global emissions, this can be very problematic. And then a final thing to say, as a nota bene, ladies and gentlemen, if you are going to finish your essay and conclude your essay by saying, well, regulation's one method of curing market failures, but there are others, such as taxes and subsidies and so on, you must compare the other policies to regulation. Don't just say there are other policies. You must compare how effective the other policies are to regulation. Okay, I'm sorry for those one or two interruptions during that video, ladies and gentlemen. Lost my train of thought for a moment. So I hope your revision goes well. If you have any questions over the weekend, do send me a message and I'll do my very best to get back to you. So that's it for now. See you.